Thank you for coming out, everybody, on an evening that is so cold that you can't even complete a thought. I really, really, really am glad that you're all here. It's going to be a wonderful night. I'm going to introduce our guests, and they're going to attempt to sit in these incredibly comfy chairs. Anne Helen Petersen is a features writer for BuzzFeed and the author of Scandals of Classic Hollywood. James Wolcott, the author of the novel The Cat Sitters, the anthology Critical Mass, and Lucking Out, My Life Getting Down and Dirty in 70s New York. Far right. Yeah. And last but certainly not least, the guest of honor, Farran Smith Nehme, who has been writing at Self-Styled Siren since 2005. I cannot tell you how much I've enjoyed reading her over the years. She writes these incredibly graceful sentences that don't so much sit on the page as sort of reside there. She's really quite remarkable. She also writes film reviews for the New York Post. Such a cultured, such a classy lady, and she is going to do us the honor of reading a section from her novel. And I cannot wait for you to meet her. Farran?
So, I'm sort of wondering, I think maybe I'll just prop this puppy here. I'm going to read a section that's it's probably about a third of the way through the book, just for the fun of it. The heroine's name is Kynwyn, and she is 21 years old and barely scraping by on a living as a retail sales clerk here in New York, and the year is 1987. And she, at this point, she has become entangled with a mathematician named Matthew. He's become a sort of boyfriend. And Matthew has invited her to a Thanksgiving dinner that is populated by mathematicians. Now, I actually worked for mathematicians for a while in the 1980s and early 90s. And one thing I can tell you is that they number a lot of cinephiles in their ranks, believe it or not. So some of these guys are sort of based on some of the personalities that I knew at the time. One of them is named Harry, who is a friend of Kynwyn and Matthew's, and another one is named Andy, who strikes Kynwyn as something of a weird customer. He's a little more obsessive, he's a collector. So they're about to sit down and sparks soon fly. So as they go in down to the dinner table, Harry blasted into the room with greetings for both of them, and he and Donna settled directly across the table. She heard Matthew say, "Looking for something?" He was addressing Andy, who was hovering nearby. "Just trying to find a seat." Andy sounded almost plaintive. "You're in luck," beamed Matthew. "One right here." He pointed to the empty chair next to hers. Andy quickly leaned past Harry to plunk his glass down at the spot like he was saving a seat at the theater. Harry's eyebrows shot toward the ceiling. Donna took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Kynwyn had come to realize that Matthew had an extremely overdeveloped sense of mischief. Still, things seemed to go all right at first, everyone passing plates and commenting on the food, and Donna exclaiming over the cleverness of Radha putting garam masala in the stuffing. They talked about Paris and what it was like in February and whether there were any good exhibits at the moment. That led to Parisian movie-going, which led to the Cinémathèque Française, which led back to silent movies, at which point Matthew asked someone to pass the wine. She told Harry that the bad part of his silent movie books was reading about a movie that sounded great, only to find out it didn't exist anymore. Four Devils, for example, or London After Midnight. "The studios never thought they had any value," growled Harry. "That's what happens when you let raw capitalism determine which art survives." "I don't disagree with that," said Andy, "but I do think it helps to put things in a broader perspective." "What kind of broader perspective do you have in mind?" Harry said that way too calmly. Lost movies appeal to our sense of doomed artistry, said Andy. The movies in your head are always much better than the movies you sit down to see. We build up heroic concepts of certain directors, and then when their work is lost, we imagine what we're missing as even better than the movies we have. In that sense, we need lost movies. They fortify our romantic ideal of cinema. That's cap our romantic, of course. She was stymied. How did you find a polite way to say, that's just about the stupidest thing I've ever heard? Postmodern poppycock, exploded Harry, pounding the consonants so hard a tiny bit of spit flew in the air. It isn't postmodernism, Harry. It's rubbish, nonsense. Have you been sneaking over to the humanities building? Any minute now, Harry's finger would be launched at Andy's chest. I'm not F.W. Murnau. I'm not Todd Browning. I'm not interested in my own puny concept of what they'd have done. I want to see those movies. I don't want to get my kicks imagining little scenes with Janet Gaynor. You're avoiding the question of, and furthermore. There went the finger, only it was pointing between Andy's eyes. I do know what happens when some slob tries to reimagine a great movie. I know because I get to sit through the last 20 minutes of The Magnificent Ambersons and see just how Robert Wise stacks up against Orson Welles. Magnificent Ambersons, said Andy, who'd been trying to break in, is a completely different instance, but now that you mention it, Harry, it actually supports my case. That's a movie where we have fragments of the director's vision. When you can see part of a movie, your imagination naturally fills in the gaps. Your interpretation of what it would have been like becomes your experience of seeing it. Reader response theory, said Matthew. You have been playing with the humanities boys, haven't you? Harry's eyebrows were about to meet his cheekbones. You've been unfaithful to us, Andy, he intoned. Sneaking off at lunch, said Matthew. Discussing Barth at secluded tables in dark little restaurants. Meeting Stanley Fish at the Washington Square Hotel. Andy's hair was vibrating. It isn't my fault you need a certain vocabulary when discussing the arts. Kindwin wasn't crazy about Andy, but she was even less fond of seeing someone ganged up on. You have to study the arts like anything else, she heard herself say. Her reward was Andy's hand giving her bare shoulder a pat. She pulled her dress back up and caught Matthew leaning a bit closer. That's right, said Andy. We aren't superior to artists. That's exactly what I'm saying. And if you'd let me finish, I was going to say that we also need theorists to illuminate what the artist is trying to do. And my original point about lost films isn't, I don't need their stinking theories, boomed Harry. Treasure of the Sierra Madre, said Matthew, like he'd hit the buzzer on Jeopardy. Andy looked stunned. So did everyone else. As they digested the fact that Matthew had referenced a movie made before Watergate, he spoke across Kindwin, addressing Andy with the air of a patient tutor. The Mexican bandits? Pretending to be officers? Bogart asked to see their badges, and the leader says, we don't need no stinking badges. Harry's glass went up in a silent toast.
You have an extra mic.
I have.
No, I have one.
Oh, Robert.
I have one. Here you go.
You want a microphone?
So one of the many wonderful things about being your friend is that rather than start a question with "Have you ever?" I can begin with "What? What movie have you had a dream about recently?"
A dream about recently?
Yeah. Do you ever dream about movies?
Oh dear, this is not very in tune with the with the theme of the book. But I had an extraordinarily vivid dream about the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I mean, at least it kind of fits with the period of this, you know, because I did go to the 8th Street Playhouse, and you know, like I got massively hit in the head with a roll of toilet tissue, you know. But it was, you know, in my dream, I was trying to do the time warp, only I was not like in sync, and everybody was getting mad at me. It would have been so much better if it was Busby Berkeley, but I'm like kind when I have a hard time lying.
Well, the reason that I mentioned it was that in the passage that you read, when you mentioned The Magnificent Ambersons, which is one of the famous, maybe arguably the most famous lost and/or butchered movie of all time, you talk about these movies that are in some ways more precious when we haven't seen them or when we have to imagine them or imagine parts of them. And I was reminded that I actually had a dream one time that I went to a sneak preview of a movie and it turned out to be a secret screening of the lost footage of The Magnificent Ambersons.
Oh my God.
And I dreamed this entire
big.
thing. It was incredible, but then I forgot it immediately after I woke up, so it was horrible. But movies invading your consciousness, movies invading your dreams. Have you ever dreamed about a movie? Have you ever obsessed over a movie in that way? One that you've seen or one that you haven't seen?
Mostly I just get nervous that I'm not going to be there on time. Like, that's what my dreams are about, because I like to be there 15 minutes before and like have my popcorn, all those things. So yeah, that's mostly, I have anxiety dreams about movies.
Yeah, the Woody Allen thing where you know, like, I'm sorry, it's 5 minutes in, I can't go anymore. That's definitely me too.
What's the farthest you've ever traveled to see a movie?
I used to drive 2 hours to go see movies when I was growing up.
Were they repertory movies?
No, they were just like any movie. I grew up in northern Idaho. So there were some movies that were like blockbusters, but if I wanted to see, I remember like, I want to see Brokeback Mountain, and I drove 2 hours to go see it, that sort of thing.
Is everybody here from somewhere else originally, I guess, right? Were there repertory cinema or cinemas?
No. I started seeing movies at because I grew up near a military base, so they had a movie theater on the base, and so that's where I saw all the masterpieces. It Happened at the World's Fair, Follow That Dream, Jerry Lewis movies, and not even the good Jerry Lewis movies, the ones that were like really mawkish, where he was like trying to, but the interesting thing was the soldiers, it was mostly soldiers in the audience, they just heckled the movies routinely. So I didn't grow up with there was no like hushing or anything. It was like they were basically telling Elvis to like, oh, come on, Elvis, come on, come on, you're not really driving that car. So and the movies I saw, and funny thing is I didn't know until later that these were like, major directors or anything. One of the very first movies I saw in Baltimore was Ride the High Country. But I didn't know anything about, it wasn't until later that I learned about Peckinpah and all that. So there was nothing like that in suburban Maryland at all. I did none of that until I came to New York.
When did you discover older movies?
We had one of those great like independent movie stores, and I don't mean independent like indie. I mean like owned by like two people who kept weird things that they liked, like kind of like near the gas station kind of place. These are very popular in like rural places in the 80s. Like you would have 15 tapes that were kind of eclectic. So my favorite was this movie called Rad, which is about BMX biking from the 1980s. That wasn't an old movie, obviously. Really, for me, it was college because I turned into a weird film. I was a math major. My parents are mathematicians, and then became a film major after watching. I think it happened one night that I like stumbled into a screening on campus, and the film teacher was like, "Come take a class," and that led to a film PhD. So,
was there a repertory house for you?
In Alabama? Gosh, no. I mean, there was like a short-lived art house, and they showed a few like foreign movies, but they were all new. No, I mean, growing up in the 80s, there was a time, and I guess it's been a while now, where old movie screening on TV were ubiquitous. They were a cheap way to fill up programming. Yeah. And so, almost any time of the day or night, you could turn on like some kind of cable movie and, see often see something really good, or there's a number of things that are hard to see now that were pretty commonly screened back in the 80s. And of course, it was pan and scan. It was edited for television in very strange ways, but you could see it, and you could fall in love with it, and then eventually, hopefully, you'd see it the way it was meant to be seen. If not in a rep house, then eventually on TCM. But I do kind of miss those days, because I would like joke that I felt like an old lady, at the slot machine in Jersey, like in Atlantic City, every time I hit like a movie that I really wanted to see or that looked great, and that thrill of discovery is not, it. I don't know. I mean, I guess you get it if you're going through the bargain DVD bins or something.
Well, it is, and it's also that same kind of thrill that you used to get when you, and I guess I don't have to explain what this is, a repertory film calendar. A repertory film calendar, like in New York, we know what that is, but other cities, many of them don't have that anymore unless it's a museum maybe. But I don't know for how they were for everybody else, but they were printed on, a newsprint with little dot patterns, like they would screen the illustrations, and you could see that people had cut out Cary Grant's head from some film book and pasted it down, and you would look at it was like 3 months, like for a calendar, and you could look ahead and you could mark off that it was they were showing The Awful Truth on November 3rd, and you knew not to schedule anything for that night. And your novel is set, I call it kind of an Atlantis story, by which I mean like this world is about to vanish.
Yeah.
It's like the last possible moment when you can have that kind of thriving and yet easygoing repertory film scene.
Right, and she of course doesn't realize it. She has no idea. I mean, she's sitting there with the tools of some of the things that are going to help it vanish. The VHS tapes that she's recorded off TV and stuff, but no, she has no idea. And yeah, it is kind of sad. I mean, like, I think I actually, when I was researching this, I mean, I think like the very next year was when, the repertory houses really started closing, like one by one. I think, like the Thalia Uptown was actually one of the first, wasn't it? And there was like one that was kind of like the Beachhead. I don't think it was the Thalia, but then there was just like and then another, and then another, and then all of a sudden, whoosh! You looked and they were gone.
There was a New Yorker theater,
yeah.
And then further down it was I think it was the Regency.
Yeah.
But the New Yorker and the Thalia were like, those were the two pillars for a long time on the Upper West Side.
They had a theater in my hometown of Dallas called the Granada, which was 45 minutes on 45 minutes on foot, 20 minutes on bike from my house, and they would have double and triple features. They'd show 3 James Bond films or 3 Pink Panther films, or sometimes an entire day of Looney Tunes shorts or Laurel and Hardy shorts. And as a result, my brother and I and a lot of other kids who were into this stuff, you would have thought that we were born in 1928 because of the tastes that we had. And that's something that we were talking about a little bit backstage, that sense of being interested in something that a person of our generation is not supposed to be interested in necessarily. Like you're a couple of generations back in what you're into. And I imagine both of you kind of get this a lot.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I first started writing my blog, I was anonymous, right? And I gradually realized, I guess it was like maybe 4 or 5 years, 5 years into writing the blog that I kind of came out. But before that, I would gradually realize that, a number of people thought they were talking to a 70-year-old. Because, they'd ask me things like, well, I'm sure as you remember when Eisenhower was president, and I'm like...
But you're conversant in that, though. I mean, you when you're into that, that's your currency.
Yeah. And when I first started writing, I started writing these columns for this website called The Hairpin about scandals of classic Hollywood. I was just kind of doing it on the side while I was writing my dissertation because I wanted to write something that wasn't academic. And the audience for that website is like 20 and 30-year-olds. And people loved it, though, because it was these stories about celebrity, which most 20 and 30-year-olds are interested in, even if tangentially or intellectually. And so trying to make them into kind of object lessons about how scandal functions and how different it was, but how actually not different it was at the same time. And then just the imagery is so gorgeous. Like, it's impossible not to be compelled by these stories. Everyone was like so beautiful in the clothes.
Well, and they're so primal too.
Yeah.
That's what I love about the stories, is finding out, like, especially the older movie stars, when you find out that, you know, Gary Cooper and Barbara Stanwyck were, having sex, getting drunk, getting divorced, and doing all the things that people have always done. Mm-hmm. It's sort of exciting. And Hollywood Babylon is that kind of a thing too. Like, I don't know how many of you have read that. Probably everyone in this room owns it. But that was in a cabinet. My mother had a special cabinet that we weren't supposed to know about of books, and Hollywood Babylon was in there, along with The Women's Room, Fear of Flying, and a bunch of other books along those lines. But I discovered it, and boy, I had no idea just how tawdry Hollywood could be until I read that.
I mean, it is and it isn't true. This is something I write about it, like, in my book, is that, like, yes, they were doing all sorts, like, things just as bad as anyone on TMZ is doing now, and the cover-up was just so much more effective. But at the same time, the reason you want to read Hollywood Babylon is because you want to believe those things about the stars. Like, you want to believe that Clara Bow slept with the entire USC football team, because it matches with, like, her image of this, like, flamboyant it girl, and it's very much not true, but it's so much more titillating to read that than to read, like she liked to hang out with football players because everyone in Hollywood was boring, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, I have to give myself credit. I never thought she slept with the entire USC football team.
Just kind of thing,
like,
right?
I mean, like, even when I read it, you know, I was like, I mean, I knew just enough to know that, like, some of the stuff was suspect, and otherwise, you know, my day job is in journalism, and I've always kind of had those, you know, pretty good instincts for when I'm being sold a bill of goods. There's a couple of stories here and there that he gets kind of right, like Wallace Reed, you know, and other ones that he gets 100% wrong, like Fatty Arbuckle.
Yeah.
Did anybody ever call him out on not getting it right?
Well, that's actually a good question for Anne Helen, because back in the the dressing room back there, I was talking to her about wanting to read a piece that she wrote about Gloria Swanson. This is, like, really good.
So Gloria Swanson's one of the few stars whose archive you can actually access in full. You can go to the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas and look at all of her stuff. I mean, she kind of went through it, like, all mentions of her affair with JFK Sr. are excised very carefully. But at the same time, she wanted to be remembered. Like, she wrote one of my favorite, actually, star biography or autobiography is hers, published in 1980, called Swanson on Swanson. And it's just, I mean, she lived this incredibly rich, vivid, like, 3-part life. Like, she really had 3 acts of her life. But one of the things that she includes in this archive is all of this hate art from Kenneth Anger, because she tried to sue him for libel. She was upset because in Hollywood Babylon, he doesn't actually say anything mean about her so much as, like, he says that she called Lana Turner a trollop, and she wanted to remember.
Heaven forfend.
I know.
Right.
And she wanted to be remembered as, like, a lady of good taste. But so because she tried to sue him for libel, he started sending her all sorts of things, including a 4-foot coffin full of sugar. This is because Gloria Swanson was, like, the first health nut. She had this book called Sugar Blues that she published in, like, 1972. And voodoo dolls of her and Valentino, like, all of this stuff. And no one had ever looked at it when I was in the archive, because I was just kind of like, what should I look at? Coffin full of sugar? Okay, let's do it. And it's bright lime green. If you look it up, you can see it online.
There's a part in Swanson on Swanson where she actually claims that, you know, cutting out meat and sugar and dairy, like, cured incipient cancer. You know, she's like, I starved my tumor. I was feeding it all of this, you know, and you know, she's Gloria Swanson. I kind of want to believe her. Oh, yeah. But I mean, I read read from other stars or whatever who were like, oh God, I love Gloria, but every time I see her, she wants to talk to me about what I'm eating. Totally.
All through the book, you've got characters who are sort of communicating through their knowledge of movies, like their knowledge of movie stars and directors and their careers. Is there anything in there that you just made up?
Well, I mean, of course, I made up Miriam, who's like, possibly my favorite character, and I made up her whole story and like sort of stitched it together from a number of different silent stars and things that happen. There's a little of Gloria Swanson in her. There's a lot of Mary Astor, who also won a beauty contest and was taken to Hollywood by two highly avaricious parents who proceeded to bleed her dry until she had to go to court to turn off the taps to get them. And I mean, I think she had to agree to pay them support or at least a settlement. There's a lot of stories like that. In terms of just making things up, well, I don't want to spoil the story, but there's one story that Miriam tells, towards the end of it that, is clearly made up because it involves Miriam. But I chose a star for that I felt that it could easily be true about. And it's a nice story. You'll know it when you see it. So.
Other than that, you've adhered to the highest standards of factual accuracy.
Well, I mean, Anne Helen was actually emailing me that she found it really funny that I have Miriam say Garbo was a sapphic, which is...
it's perfect.
Garbo's sexuality is actually something of a mystery. So I was having Miriam make a judgment call based on what she might have heard being around Hollywood. I mean, I know that there were lesbian rumors about Garbo for a very long time. Otherwise, for the most part, yeah, I really tried not to put rubbish in the book about the stars, because I spend so much time trying to slap down rubbish. I spend so much time trying to kind of disabuse people of cherished stories. Every time somebody brings up the old story about and it varies. Somebody digging up, taking John Barrymore's body out of the funeral home. Sometimes it's Raoul Walsh. Sometimes it's Errol Flynn. But I've encountered this story so many times, and it just does not hold water. I mean, it depends on so many different variables. And here's a tip: when you encounter a Hollywood story that exists in several different versions, be very wary, because it's quite likely that none of them are all that well sourced.
Wouldn't you have thought that the internet would have completely cured us of anything that's factually inaccurate by this point? When all this knowledge is at our fingertips.
Yeah, no. What it does is it multiplies the initial mistakes and misimpressions, and I see things all the time that I just, oh God, that again? Mm-hmm. That's resurfaced?
Like what?
Oh, well, I don't even want to give the whole story, but the whole thing about Pauline Kael and Richard Nixon and nobody I know voted for him, which has, if you go back and look at the original quote, it's actually a very, mundane thing, but it's been used for 30 years of this is how out of touch liberals are, that they don't. But there are a lot of things that just stories that just come up, and I mean, usually not movie related, but just things that come up all the time, and and it's part of it is because people are recycling the same stuff on the internet, and they actually don't go back to books, right, or things that are stuff that was happened at the time. Stuff that, they don't go back to the archive of the New Yorker of a certain period, or, whatever. I've seen certain quotes attributed to Susan. I mean, one of the things, if you're on Twitter, you see quotes attributed all the time to people that they didn't say. I mean, I saw somebody attributed Aristotle today. It's Aristotle didn't talk like that, and nearly 90% of what's attributed to Einstein is just not true. Yeah. So
I invented the internet, Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, I know. It has a multiplication effect and an impact, and then it's as everyone knows who's been slandered on the internet or whatever, slimed. getting rid of it. You can never get rid of it. It's like you just, it's almost you just have to live with it because it just keeps following. It's there eternally.
You mentioned this idea of being able to go back and check books, and I was going to say I love being in this room and being surrounded by books, all these leather-bound volumes and all these hardcover books, and many of them are predate probably the building that they're in, and that's something that this novel really captures too. That feeling of contemplation, like people are not checking Twitter in this book. They're not, and you can't DVR something, you can't run something back, and there's just a sense of waiting for something.
Right. I mean, you have one thing that I think about sometimes when I go back to old movie books, especially ones that cover like a comprehensive number of old movies, is how I'll find errors in there, but it's about like a movie, a cast error or a quote that's not rendered quite right. But they were doing it in an age where if they wanted to see the movie, either they had to, wait for it to come on someplace, or, go to a library and find a flatbed projector and try to look at a 16 millimeter or something. Who's going to be able to do that? So, it was fun writing about, I had to really sit down and think, if you were trying to find a lost movie in 1987, how would you go about it? How would you go about finding people's contact information? How would you get in touch with them? How would you introduce yourself? What would be your resources?
The great film scholar David Bordwell, who I've been so fortunate to get to know in the last couple of years. A lot of you, if you took a film class, you read his and Kristen Thompson's books on film, basic film theory and how to read a movie, essentially. And I asked him one time, he and Kristen have been doing this since the 70s, and I said, how did you get the screenshots? I called them screenshots because, that's what they are now with the internet. How did you get the screenshots? And he said, well, we had to go to a theater, and we had to get the print, and it was great if you knew somebody who was an archivist, because then they could thread up the print in the projector. And he actually put a camera on a tripod and was taking pictures of the movie.
Well,
that was his technique. It was very analog, I guess.
That's much better than the preservation horror stories that I've heard about certain prints and stuff being scissored, for books and collections of prints.
The other thing that they would do is they would only use stills, like publicity stills, and oftentimes a publicity still, they had like a camera did that, and then that shot wouldn't even make it into the film, right. And so people would write off of the publicity stills, which were depicting shots not in the actual film.
Right. It was just sort of like a representation of the overall spirit of the movie as as designed to get people into the theaters.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bordwell talked about that too, and I think we have more contact with movies as an actual object, but ironically, at the time when movies themselves are disappearing as things that are on film, and that you sit there and you watch it on spool and someone brings it in a big can. But I don't want to get into that too much because it would only make me sad. And I'd much rather have you sign some books and maybe take some questions first if anybody has any. Any questions for any of us, for Farran, about movies, about anything? Yes?
No, for you, Mike, just
okay.
Hi, Farran.
Hi, Don.
I have the pleasure of working with Farran in journalism. I have a question about these kinds of wonderful movies, which in my mind, I call human being movies, versus the cartoon special effects. I once heard a theory about a pivot point that happened with a certain movie that switched it from that era, your era, to the new era. One theory was it was Jaws, where the monster became more important than the humans, and Star Wars, where merchandising became more important than box office, as an example. Do you feel there has been any kind of pivot point that changed movies from everything you're discussing to the current offerings, if indeed you feel it's a different, almost entire different focus, which I personally do, but I was wondering, A, if you feel that, and B, where you think this inflection point might have been?
I mean, I think that the Jaws, Star Wars, like 76, 77, Nexus was more of a watershed for what they called the new Hollywood, the more like kind of maverick auteur-centered filmmaking that had sprung up in Hollywood in the late 60s and early 70s. I mean, I think that for what I love, which is the really old stuff, the inflection point is probably either 47 or 48, the Supreme Court decision that forced the studios to decouple the theaters. Before that, they were truly vertically integrated. They owned the studios, they owned the distributors, they owned the theater chains. After that, they had to start divesting, and that began this sort of slow unraveling. And then, in addition to that, as they lost this source of revenue, you can see the productions getting smaller through the 50s for the most part. It's not as lavish, in part because they didn't have the same kind of financial wherewithal. And then there's you see the decade kind of sliding towards the studios breaking up until in the 60s that happens, and it kind of also coincides with the waning influence of the production code. So I mean, those would be the inflection points for the stuff that I care about more. I mean, I care about current movies as well, but the mid-70s blockbuster thing, I don't know. I mean, I kind of blame it all on Batman.
I sort of do too. It's funny you should say that. The first one you're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The Tim Burton. I remember the great big what year was that?
1989.
Okay, yeah. So Kymwin is also blissfully ignorant of what's right around the corner. I can tell she's not going to like Batman either.
Why do you think that's
synergy?
Yeah.
So it's the beginning of cross promotion all up and down. I mean, and all of Time Warner getting behind what was about to become Time Warner in 1990.
And it was also the first really, really big blockbuster movie, in the Star Wars tradition, to set its video release date well before the movie was out of theaters. And they said, it's opening in whatever it was, June or something. It will be on theaters by November so that people can buy it and it'll be under the Christmas trees. And I remember even as a college student seeing that it was in the stories, that was in the reviews. It's like the movie, which will be out on video in November, and I thought, wow, I guess they must think it's not going to do very well. I didn't understand that was a whole new way.
And it was at a price point that people could afford, because before then, a VHS tape was, could be $70.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Not so much a question as a comment about the Kenneth Anger. I talked to Kenneth Anger about this, and he didn't give me a direct answer, but sort of come on, are you really asking me what's going on? This was after he'd screened his films back at the American Cinematheque in LA. But if you read the book carefully, the whole book is wink, 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 wink.
Yeah, totally.
So I think his point to me was, I don't really have to answer this because you know.
What specifically was your question? Did you lie your ass off, or?
No, it was something more vague because I was, embarrassed and trying to, because he was talking about his movies, but something about the nature of the book, and he said something like, "Let's talk about the films. We don't need to talk about the book, do we?" It's something. He was he sort of gave me that sort of that. And he was right. I mean, I kind of, because when I went back and read the book a lot more carefully, and then if you read it, you can see that sort of those are sort of conditional stuff all over the book, as if this is what would have liked to have happened. And so I think he was completely conscious that he was pulling on everything that possibly, he was pulling on what we wanted to hear, what we've heard. Every little gossip or rumor got in that book. And I think he was very amused that people took it literally.
Mm-hmm. Now that you're saying that, it's reminding me of that old TV series In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, where they would make these outrageous claims that they would say, could it be that the ancient Mayans were really from, And could it be that Farran could sign some books for us? I don't know, where are we going to set this up? Is it right there? Okay, so thank you, Farran.
Thank you all for coming
Thank you,
this
Anne.
evening.
Thank
We
you,
do
Jen.
have additional copies of